Hi, my name is Ethan. I am an educator here at Chiha Park and Zoo. Um, I'm going to talk to you today about invasive species and competition. So, to start, let me just share my screen with you, and we're going to follow this PowerPoint presentation I made, and I'm also going to show you some cool animals along the way. So let's start by talking about an ecosystem. So what do I mean whenever I say ecosystem? Can you tell me what an ecosystem means? It's okay to take a guess here. Whenever I say ecosystem, what do you think I'm talking about?
Different types of animals.
Mm-hmm. So it's not just animals though, it's also plants and fungus and anything else that's around. Um, so it's how all of these things interact with each other is an ecosystem. So in a healthy ecosystem, there are things like, say, grass, and the grass is getting its energy from the sun, and other things like crickets and bugs are eating things like the grass, as and then other things are eating them, and then other things are eating them, and it goes up and around, and everything's interacting with each other, and some things are eating each other, and other things are producing food, and everything's working out in a nice, healthy way, right? So it'll go all the way up. Uh, Say you have a tree, insects are eating the leaves that fall from the tree and turning it into good compost, which is that dirt that the insects are pooping out, because insects do that a lot, um, turns into fresh grass, which is then eaten by things like turtles. And then the turtles get eaten by things like hawks. And then the hawks poop, and they poop out usable soil that's eaten by other insects and fungus and things like that, and everything cycles into itself, right? It's all um, a, it's all like a fine-tuned machine. Everything's working together. But what happens if I add something into that cycle here? So let's take a look at this food web that I have here. Um, let's say that this grass is growing and things like the grasshoppers and deer and gazelle and stuff eat it. But let's say that a new species of grass moves into the area, and none of these creatures really know to eat it. They just know that it exists, and they're not going to eat it. What's going to happen?
It's not going to be a part of the ecosystem.
Nope, it's not going to be a part of the ecosystem. That's exactly right. It's not going to be a part of the ecosystem. And so, let's say that this new species of grass that nothing eats just takes over, and this old species of grass that everything eats just doesn't exist anymore. What's going to happen?
Can you say it one more time, please?
If like this new kind of grass, right? Like I said, like let's say that this invasive species of grass comes in, and it outcompetes this type of grass that all of these creatures rely on. And these creatures don't eat the new grass. It just exists. They don't know that it's edible, so they don't eat it. What's going to happen to all of these creatures up the line here?
They might die.
That's exactly what's going to happen. They're going to have to move, they're going to have to adapt, or they're going to have to die. It's math. I remember it from the acronym MAD: move, adapt, or die. MAD, MAD. So some of these animals might have the option of moving somewhere else, right? Like the eagle up here at the top might be able to just move to a different location where that grass still exists. Other animals might have to adapt. So, like this gazelle over here might have to adapt to eating the new grass, or it might have to find a different source of food entirely, or like this mouse might have to find a different source of food. Other creatures will just simply die, like these grasshoppers. They they probably won't be able to find a new source of food and they probably won't be able to adapt to eating something else. So they're just going to die. They're out of luck. Um, so what happens whenever invasive species come in is they cause all sorts of problems. They make it so that all of this finely tuned energy machine where energy moves from the plants to the animals to other animals and then eventually back into the plants again, it just gets thrown out of whack. All of it gets completely thrown out of whack. Um, so invasive species, hold on, yeah, there we go. What is an invasive species? An invasive species is a creature that is not native and is harmful to the habitat that they live. So they can be things like wild pigs, Africanized honeybees, plants like kudzu, which is starting to take over the deep south. These are all examples of invasive species. They are creatures that didn't exist here naturally, that got here somehow, and now that they are here, they are hurting the ecosystem. They're out competing with stuff in the ecosystem and making it harder for the creatures that exist to survive. So how do these invasive species appear? How do they get here? They can be things, they can be introduced through things like agriculture. So if we bring a new type of crop here, then that new type of crop might spread. So they can be introduced through things like agriculture. They can be accidentally brought here. So this is actually a very common thing to happen. The zebra mussel, which is this little oyster that lives in streams, it got moved all across the country because people would take their boats and move them to different ponds and streams. And on their boats were actually the oysters, and the oysters spread throughout the streams and stuff. So they kind of got piggybacked here. Things like wildlife trafficking and the pet trade can cause invasive species to show up. So if somebody, say, buys a goldfish and then they decide that they don't want that goldfish anymore and they release it into the nearby pond, that goldfish isn't going to necessarily just die off or go away. And if there's enough of them released in a place, these goldfish might start breeding. And then if they're breeding, they're taking over the pond. These goldfish don't normally live in the pond. Suddenly they're living everywhere in the pond, right? And another thing that drives invasive species is climate change. So a lot of creatures that only lived in the tropical regions before, now that we're getting warmer and warmer weather further and further north, these animals that lived in the tropics and these plants that lived in the tropics are starting to be able to survive winters in more northern places, and so they're starting to migrate further and further north. So I think that is a good place to stop for just a moment on the PowerPoint slide, and I want to show you a cool animal that I brought with me, because we're going to talk a little bit more about how these invasive species get introduced. And I have a couple animals that I have one example of an invasive species. I have one animal that is affected by invasive species, and I have one animal that could become an invasive species if we don't take really good care. So I'm going to show you the last one that I just mentioned here first, the animal that is not native and is usually used as a pet. This is a very common pet. It's kind of an exotic pet, and it's becoming a really big issue in places like Florida because these animals get released into the wild either by accident or on purpose, and they start to establish populations in the wild. And because these new animals don't have any predators or anything, they just flourish. They just grow exponentially, and nobody really knows how to deal with them. So I'm gonna get this animal and I'm gonna show it to you here. Give me 1 second. This guy here is Jake. He is a red-tailed boa. And the reason why he's sticking his head up so much is because he likes to climb trees. So he he's looking for something to climb up here. Jake is a red-tailed boa, as I said. Red-tailed boas are not native to the United States, but in Florida, there's actually one county in Florida that has a breeding population of red-tailed boas. That means that these guys are living in the wild and they are able to reproduce and survive in the wild. And that's a really big problem because since they're not native, they don't have any natural predators. There's nothing that keeps them in check. So they just grow and grow and grow and grow, and nothing really is able to stop them. And so they outcompete other creatures that live in places like Florida. Uh, as you can see here, he's exploring around. He's pretty cool. He's flicking out his tongue. I don't know how much you know about snakes, but snakes flick out their tongue so that they can smell things. So their tongue is actually what they'll do is they'll collect little bits of moisture. He's really exploratory right now. Hold on one second. Let me get him under control a little bit. Ooh, he's a big snake. They will flick out their tongue. Sorry, he's just moving around a lot. They will flick out their tongue to try to smell stuff around them. They'll collect little pieces of moisture in the air, and they will stick their tongue back in and rub it up against the top of their mouth, and they have what's known as a Jacobson's organ, which will process those smells and tell him exactly what what he's looking for here. So he's probably sniffing around. He's probably smelling me. He probably can't smell you because you're on camera, but he can smell the computer that I'm in front of here. And these guys, as you can see, get very large. Or maybe you can't see right now because he's wrapping around my leg. Very big. He's a very big snake. uh, and they eat things like mice whenever they're smaller. And then as they get this big, they actually will even eat other snakes and other things like that. Because I guess think about it. If you were a snake and you were shaped like a snake, the easiest thing for you to eat would be other things shaped like snakes, right? So they eat other snakes. And that's a really big issue because these native snakes are getting eaten, they're getting outcompeted. Hey there. And they're just such an overwhelming problem. Hey there. He's just sniffing, he's trying to figure out what I am here. So I'm gonna put him back now here.
Is he
Do you have
venomous?
Yes, I was about to ask, do you have any questions? He is not venomous. He is a boa constrictor. So he is a red-tailed boa. He's called a red-tailed boa because he's got this kind of reddish tail to him, which is going to be hard to show off here because he's really good at wrapping around me here. But he is not venomous. He is a constrictor. So what he will do is he will grab hold of his prey with his mouth, and then he will wrap himself around his prey until they are suffocated and die. And once he has suffocated his prey, oh boy, he is a strong snake. Once he has suffocated his prey, he will eat them whole by unhinging his jaw and just sort of using these very powerful muscles. I'd show you where they were on your like on his head, but he is currently wrapped both of my arms together and I can't point out anything, but he has these very powerful jaw muscles that he will use to swallow his food whole. Any other questions about Jake?
How long is he?
Jake is probably a good 6 or 7 feet long. It's not really obvious because he wraps himself up like this, but he gets a little bit longer than people, and that's about as long as he's going to get. This is probably about as big as he will get. They can get about 7-ish feet, 8-ish feet sometimes. Any other questions about Jake?
How old is he?
I don't know. We got him because a person who had Jake as a pet didn't want him anymore, and whenever people don't they can't take care of pets or they don't want a pet anymore, sometimes if they are a cool enough animal, the zoo will take them in. Uh, and that was true for Jake here. Now I'm going to put him back real quick, but you can keep asking me questions. He's just starting to get a little stressed out, so I'm going to put him away. It was kind of a struggle putting him back there. He just kept trying to get back out. We have this big old, it's literally just a water cooler for transporting him around. We keep him in a proper cage and stuff whenever we don't have him, but to move him around in a water cooler, that's how we move him around, just in a big cooler. And he was just, every time I got the tail in, his head was out, and every time I put the head back in, his tail was coming out. They really they're very heavy movers. They like to climb around in trees and down in water. They will swim around near water and collect food that way. Any other questions about Jake?
How often do you feed him?
We feed him about once a week. So it kind of ranges. Some snakes we feed once every 2 weeks. Some snakes we feed once a week. Some snakes we feed sort of on a weird rotation where we feed them twice in 2 weeks and then we skip a week. Um, it just depends. He is an ectotherm, which means that he is cold-blooded. And so he doesn't really need as much food as, say, you or I do, because he doesn't generate any body heat, which is the thing that requires most of our energy. Any other questions about Jake, or should we move on?
We can move on.
Okay. If you have any more questions about Jake, feel free to ask again whenever we're done with our talk here. But so invasive, Jake is an example of an animal that isn't yet considered an invasive species, but might be here in the near future because they keep getting introduced into the wild because people will buy them as pets and then might not necessarily realize how much work is involved in getting and keeping a red-tailed boa, or maybe a storm like a hurricane hits and they can't take them with them, so they just get washed away into the wild, and then they survive and they find other red-tailed boas who found themselves in the wild, and next thing you know, you've got a population of red-tailed boas running amok. So there we go. Let's talk about species interactions here, because we are kind of talking about species interactions already just by talking about invasives. So there are generally 5 types of species interactions. There's predation, which also in this case is herbivory as well. So it's whenever animals eat grass, technically they're being predators to the grass and plants and stuff. And it's also things like parasitism, which is whenever, say, like a leech latches onto you or another creature acts like a parasite. Those are all examples of predation whenever I say predation here. So predation is whenever one animal hunts another animal or hurts another animal for its own gain. So the organism doing the hunting, the predator, gains something from the exchange, whereas the other organism loses. So like a cheetah catches a gazelle, or that snake that I just showed catches a rat, or anything like that. That's predation. Then there's what's known as amensalism. Amensalism is whenever one organism antagonizes another organism. So it's whenever the first organism doesn't necessarily gain anything by doing it, but it hurts the other organism. And this one's not very common, but you see it in things like viruses. One of the ways that we actually stop viruses from spreading, including the coronavirus, COVID-19, is we look for what enzymes and proteins and stuff that the virus latches onto, and we just simply put something there that blocks it. It's like a blocker. So that's an example of amensalism. So it's whenever one organism doesn't really gain or lose anything from it, but the other organism loses something from the interaction. So uh, it's kind of an interesting one to think about. You have mutualism, which is whenever both organisms gain something from the experience. And whenever I think of mutualism, I usually think of, teamwork, cooperation, things like that. But the animal example that I can think of with mutualism is clownfish and an enemy. Um, uh, Clownfish usually they hide in an enemy and they gain something. Oh, I'm sorry, that's commensalism. Sorry, I was getting ahead of myself. Commensalism is whenever clownfish hide in an enemy and they gain protection from the anemone. The anemone doesn't really get much out of it. Another example are things like cattle egret. You've ever gone past like a barn and there's cows around and there are those little white fluffy birds sitting on top of the cows? Those are called cattle egrets, and they hunt for bugs that live near the cows. And the cows get a benefit from the fact that there aren't just flies buzzing around their heads all the time, and the birds get food out of the deal. So that would be an example of mutualism. Commensalism, as I just said, is whenever one animal gains, but the other animal doesn't really gain or lose anything from the deal. And that's things like a clownfish uh, living in an enemy. They get the benefit of being defended by the anemone, but the anemone doesn't really get anything out of the deal. It just exists. And then there's competition, which is what invasive species do. Competition is whenever one animal is directly competing with another one for a resource. And that one, as you can see, gets a net negative from both sides because you have to, neither animal really gains from competition. So this is kind of a layout of the different kinds of things. Do you have any questions on these interactions, or would you like me to explain one a little bit better? Nope. Okay. We're going to move
Could you
on. Oh, yes. Sorry.
can you explain the last one again?
Competition. So whereas all the other ones, somebody gains something from the deal, right? Or they don't lose anything. So like predation, one animal gains something at the expense of another animal. Mutualism, both sides gain something. Commensalism is an example where one side gains, but the other side doesn't really gain or lose anything. And competition is whenever neither side gains from the situation. So competition is things like if, say, a two animals were both hunting the same prey, and they're hunting and hunting and hunting the exact same prey, then really they'd be in competition with each other. And so on top of already having to hunt down that prey, they also have to compete with another animal hunting the exact same thing. It's why usually in the animal kingdom, and food webs and ecosystems, different animals look for different kinds of food because that way they don't have to compete with each other very much. And so competition happens whenever two animals are competing for the exact same resource. So in the case of invasive species, usually an invasive species will come in and will outcompete the local species because on top of usually these local species are looking for a specific kind of food or resource. And now all of a sudden you get this new creature coming in that doesn't have to deal with predation and doesn't have to deal with things like that. They don't have to worry about predators eating them. They can survive in the climate better, things like that. And all of a sudden they outcompete and the organism that had been living there, like the grass, for instance, or uh, the snakes that live in Florida normally they get outcompeted by things like Burmese pythons that are introduced from pet trades and things like that. Did that make sense? It's kind of a hard concept to explain without an example. Did that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, cool. I'm going to show you some animals here too. Don't worry. So we already talked about what an invasive species is. So competition is whenever an invasive species moves in, they outcompete the native populations. They cause things like other animals start to go extinct because they just show up and take all of the resources. And they also drive things like habitat loss because suddenly these other animals have to either move, adapt, or die because the ecosystem has changed because these new creatures are showing up. Um, so um, let me show you an example of a creature that is being threatened by competition. Um, he was a lot easier to handle than it's this guy right here. This is a splendid tree frog. He's a lot easier to handle than Jake the snake, our red-tailed boa. But splendid tree frogs, also sometimes known as magnificent tree frogs, they live in Australia, and they, up until about 30 or 40 years ago, were extremely common frogs. And they're often kept as pets, and they're still fairly common, but they are endangered. And the reason why they are an endangered species is because they are being outcompeted by cane toads. Cane toads are an invasive species of toad in Australia that have sort of shown up and just taken over the place. Um, they are large and in charge, and even though these guys here have huge poison sacs on the top of their head, it's kind of hard to see, but these little bumps here, those are poison sacs. They're filled with poison, so you don't really want to eat these things. But cane toads are immune to the poison, so they just eat these. Whew, he just hopped right onto the camera, onto the screen there. I was hoping he wouldn't do that. But these guys, uh, cane toads are completely immune to their poison. So they just eat these things. So they outcompete these tree frogs, and then they also eat the tree frogs. So these guys are actually a threatened species because of an invasive species like the cane toad. Do you have any questions about splendid tree frogs?
No.
No? Well, they are very, very cool little frogs. Um, but unfortunately, their entire way of life is being threatened by the invasive cane toad. So we're going to put him back here on the time here. Um, so uh, if invasive species are such a problem, what can we do to combat invasives? Um, So the best defense is prevention entirely. So we can completely prevent invasive species from showing up in the first place. So you can do things like if you're buying a pet, to make sure that you got the pet from that. If the pet is an exotic pet, you don't release it into the wild. You make sure that if you say take a boat out onto a lake, you wash the boat before you bring it in because the boat could be carrying um, uh, stuff, spores from invasive plants or other things like that. You check your clothes and luggage whenever you travel places to make sure that you're not accidentally bringing any unwanted passengers back home. If you have a garden, you make sure that you plant native plants because whenever you plant exotic plants, they have a tendency to spread out past your garden and become invasive species. There's all kinds of programs in place, things like people go out there and uproot invasive plants. They hunt invasive animals and things like that. So it's not all doom and gloom. It's not like an unsolvable problem. It's just a really big problem that we need to be more mindful about as we move forward. So I want to talk about, we'll get to that example last, but let's talk about two examples of invasive species. There's wild pigs, which are the most destructive invasive species just by money. Like economically, they are the worst invasive species. They can be found in 39 states and 4 provinces of Canada. And just in the state of Texas last year, they caused $400 million in damage. That's like an unfathomable number to me. $400 million is such a crazy huge amount, and they just do that. They did that just in the state of Texas. In the other 38 states that they are in, they cause even more damage. And what they are is they're literally just native pigs, or not native pigs, they're non-native. They're just pigs that we had, and then a couple of them accidentally got released into the wild and started breeding. And as they bred, they caused all sorts of damage. And they are currently a huge issue that we are still working on solving. But they're absolutely massive. And let's talk about a success story. And did you know that the province of Alberta, which is this one right over here, that one spot, has no rats? There are no rats in Alberta. So rats normally can be found everywhere that people are found. They have spread because they live in places where humans did, where humans do, and they have spread all across the globe and caused all kinds of damage. But the province of Alberta in Canada has can safely say that they do not have any native rats. They don't have any rats. No rats have managed to make it into Alberta. And the reason why is because since Alberta started getting populated in the 1800s, they have had a very strong rat prevention program. And to talk about rats, I want to bring one of my rats out here. This is Bruce. He is our rat. And this little guy is one of the most widespread invasive species in the world. Um, they live alongside humans, and they pretty much follow humans everywhere. Um, uh, and they spread a lot of human disease because they live alongside humans. So things like the bubonic plague way back during in the Middle Ages, that was spread by rats. And so they can carry human diseases, and they follow humans around, and they outcompete other animals that live where humans move to. And there's such a widespread species nowadays that they literally live everywhere on the planet, even though they came from Norway originally, except for Alberta, Canada, because Alberta has managed to keep rats out by doing things like hunting down rat infestations and destroying them before they spread, um, using different kinds of rat traps, and actually having a lot of money that they just pool using taxes to make sure that they keep rats out. And it's actually an ongoing thing. They continuously, every year, set aside a little bit of money to try to keep the rat population from showing up in Alberta. And every year they spend almost all of that money keeping the rat population low. Do you have any questions about rats?
Will the snake eat the rat?
Yes, which is why we don't keep them together. Uh, our snake will absolutely eat a rat. Um, and actually, that brings up an interesting point, because a question you might have after that is, if rats are a problem and things like invasive snakes are a problem, then shouldn't that problem solve itself? Because the snakes will eat the rats. And the answer is no, not necessarily, because snakes will eat other things just as often as they eat rats. So actually, one of the methods that we sometimes use to combat invasive species is to introduce a predator of that invasive species, but it doesn't always work out because sometimes that predator might go hunt other things instead. Any other questions about rats or invasive species in general?
No.
Okay, well, this is my little rat friend. His name is Bruce, and I'm gonna put him up now. So I've talked a little bit about invasive species. What invasive species are? They are non-native, harmful species. They can be plants, animals, fungus, you name it. Um, and we've taken a look at a few different animals that are affected by invasives, might be invasive species in the near future, and are actively being invasive species. And we've talked about the different ways that animals interact with each other. And invasive species act by being competition for other animals, and it makes other animals' lives more difficult, and it hurts our ecosystem. So that is all the time we have for invasive species. Thank you for coming. Do you have any final questions about invasive species or anything like that?
No.
Okay, great. Well, I hope you have a good day, and maybe I will see you in the future. Bye.